Thank you. Thank you very much, guys. Wow. Somewhat like the mosquito in the nudist colony. I'm not quite sure where to begin. I want to thank Professor Sturber for being here. I told him he was going to be sort of in the lion's den, but I also told him that conservative audiences are very polite, very respectful, would hear him out, would listen to his arguments, which is not always the case when Charlie Kirk or Ben Shapiro or I set foot on the liberal campus. We don't often get that. To Professor Sturber's credit, he has advanced an argument. And I think that's important because we're living in an age where at least the most prominent socialists, people like AOC and Rashida Tlaib, they don't make arguments. They give you wild gesticulations, bug eyes, gestures, threats. Miami won't be here in 5 years. But what we have had here is something that actually is valuable in politics, and in fact, very valuable and scarce on the campus, which is actually two people of differing points of view trying to think it through and argue it out. Now, Jim Sturber is a philosopher, and he has advanced a sort of philosophical argument for socialism that relies on a kind of stark division of society into two camps. The rich, who have surplus, and the poor, who cannot meet their basic needs. And he's talking about the reciprocal claims that these two groups kind of have on each other. The rich want to kind of hold on to their stuff, and the poor want to seize, they think justly, the possessions of the rich in order to meet their needs. So this is the sort of intellectual structure on which this whole argument relies. Now, first of all, I think it's important to point out that this does not actually resemble the actual debate in the United States over socialism. We're not talking about a safety net. We're not talking about people who are unable to have food to meet their basic needs. We're not talking about people who go to the emergency room and don't get care. None of that is actually even happening in America. Jim Sturber's example, it does have relevance, but I would say its relevance would be far more to, say, my home country of India. Why? Because in India, you actually have millions of people who are starving. Even if they try to work, they can't. They cannot meet their basic needs. And in a sense, Jim Sturber is saying they have a right to grab. They have a right to take, let's say, food off the plate of a rich guy who's got a full plate and doesn't need to eat it all. But interestingly, when we sort of descend out of the world of the academy into the actual streets and slums of India, what do we see? I like to speak about this in a sort of personal way. When I grew up in India, India was a desperately poor country. It was, in fact, the begging bowl of the world. When I first came to America in 1978, a very common thing that parents would tell their kids is, Johnny, you better eat your food because there are millions of starving people in India. India was seen basically as the world's basket case. And Gandhi spoke about what he called his dream of wiping a tear off every Indian face. Now when I go back to India, India is more prosperous. Of course, there are still poor people, but there are fewer of them. In fact, the middle class, which was tiny when I was growing up, is now huge. So, in fact, lots of tears have been wiped off Indian faces. But the question is, how? Who did that? Who made that happen? The short answer is that India's poverty was not caused because India's been poor for centuries, but was exacerbated by socialism, and India's improvement has been caused entirely by capitalism. So Gandhi didn't really know it, but it's technological capitalism that is wiping a tear off every Indian face. In the India I grew up in, if you wanted to get food, you had to go to the government for a ration card. Today, there's much more abundance in India. In fact, today American parents tell their children, Johnny, you better study hard because there are millions of Indians waiting to take your job. That's the new, prosperous, successful, capitalist India. And if you try to promote socialism in India today, you will be laughed off the street. When an American company advertises for jobs, there are long lines around the block because the Indians know that this is the way to their deliverance. Now, let's come to America. By the way, I have a friend of mine in Bombay who has been trying to emigrate to America. The poor guy has never been able to get a visa. And finally I said to him, hey, why are you so eager to come to America? He goes, Dinesh, I really want to move to a country where the poor people are fat. And I mention this because in America, and this is the thing that struck me most about coming to this country, there's an abundance to the life of the ordinary guy. We were shooting our film in Los Angeles. Try to walk up to a homeless guy and give him a donut. He will throw it in your face. He'll say things like, that's too many calories, man. So we're living in a country where poverty doesn't have the theoretical meaning ascribed to it by Jim Sturber. This is not the actual world we live in. We are living in a world where socialism is more accurately described this way. I was recently watching 60 Minutes. And you might say, Dinesh, 60 Minutes, really? Why? That's for another day. But I was watching Leslie Stahl interview a medical student named Joe Babinski. And Joe Babinski was saying, oh man, it's really a pain in the butt because I have all these medical student loans and they're really interfering with my ability to study to be a doctor. It would be so great if we had free college, free medical education, then I could totally concentrate on becoming an amazing doctor. And Leslie Stahl was sort of nodding with, her usual appreciative idiocy. And I was thinking to myself, okay, go ahead and ask him the question. But what is the question? The question is, okay, Joe, what if you have free college and then you become a doctor? Do you plan to work for free? Now, this never occurred to Leslie Stahl. It never occurred to Jim Babinski. It was a shared agreement between them that he had no such plans. He wants some other working class guy, some doorman at the Trump Hotel or some other guy working in a mine to pay his tuition so that this guy can then drive a Lexus or a BMW and have the lifestyle of a doctor, but without having to pay his own loans. Now, I don't want to make an argument by example here. I want to actually zoom into a theme that is really stressed by American socialists. Namely, when you tell the American socialists, look, socialism is a disaster. It's failed everywhere in the world. It's collapsed in more than 25 working examples. It just doesn't work. It ultimately is the most discredited idea, I would say, since slavery. Now, of course, slavery's gone. I mean, we have certain forms of slavery, sex slavery, and so on. But what we don't have in the world today is any intelligent or serious group of people, and certainly no political party, that says, we want to bring back slavery. Now, we agree that previous efforts to create slavery didn't really work, but we're going to get it right this time. If someone said that, you think they were insane. But that is actually what people say about socialism. This time, we're really going to make it work. And if they look around the world, they say our model isn't, it isn't the Soviet Union, it's not dictatorial socialism, it's not Mao Zedong, it's not even Venezuela, it's Scandinavia. We want what can be called Sven socialism. Because Sven is kind of a nice guy, right? Sven is a little bit of a Pierre Trudeau. He's fashionably metrosexual. He carries a lady's handbag. He bikes to work in his suit. His furniture is from IKEA. He listens to ABBA. Now, this may all be a little strange, but it's not bad. And so the left goes, look, socialism in Norway, in Finland, in Sweden is pretty good. Let's have that. I want to zoom in and argue that this Scandinavian model that is often touted for socialism is not only unachievable, it's not what the left even wants. First of all, let me say a word about Scandinavian socialism. In Scandinavian socialism, number one, they don't interfere with the goose that is making the golden eggs. In other words, they let the capitalist system generate prosperity. It's not socialism in that sense. Corporate tax rates in Scandinavia, no higher than in America. Bernie Sanders wants to impose financial transaction fees on Wall Street companies. No Scandinavian country does that. No Scandinavian country has a minimum wage. No Scandinavian country has a wealth tax of the kind that Elizabeth Warren or Bernie Sanders wants. No Scandinavian country has an inheritance tax. You can leave 100% of your dough to your kids. That's Scandinavia. Let's have that. Now, the Scandinavians do have all kinds of entitlements. But here's the key point. Their entitlements are based on the idea that they are a single tribe. They're all in it together. It's kind of like the old Viking days. When we go and grab booty, we share it among the tribe. But everybody gets a benefit, and everybody has to pay. This is the key point. The Scandinavians have high tax rates, 60 and 70%, and people like Bernie say, oh yeah, that's great, let's have that here. Here's the difference. The Scandinavians impose those taxes on people making starting at $50,000 a year. In other words, if you make $50,000 a year, turn over half to the federal government. The 50% tax rate does not kick in at 400,000 or 500,000. It kicks in at a very low level. In other words, the Scandinavians not only soak the rich, they soak the middle class, and they soak the poor. How do they soak the poor? They have a VAT tax, 25%. Anything you buy is taxed at that rate. Jim will tell you, any economist will tell you that a VAT tax is highly regressive, which means it imposes a much higher burden on the poor than it does on the middle class, and a higher burden on the middle class than on the rich, because the poor are more dependent on those consumption items, and so it's a greater fraction of what they have. So the Scandinavian model is really simple. Everyone's in the tribe, everyone benefits, but everyone has to fork over. The key to American socialism is not to do that. American socialists are not unification socialists, they're division socialists. Their whole thing is to divide society, the rich against the poor, the black against the white, the male against the female, the straight against the gay. So their idea is to chop up society into these sort of rival groups and set them against each other. The Scandinavians don't do this. They don't demonize the rich. The rich guy is also Sven. So the Scandinavians try to bring society together into a single group. So the Scandinavian model, in short, is not what the American socialists want. Not at all. Let me, in the time I have left, pick up a philosophical thread that Professor Sturber raised to kind of stay in the philosophical domain of this debate. Try to imagine we live right now in a socialist turning point conference. And it's a hypothetical. And let's say that all of us in this room have $100. So it's socialism, pure equality. We all have the same. Marx's dream world has been realized. Now, one guy, it could be Jim Sturba, it could be me. In this case, it's more likely to be me. I publish a book, and I say, here's my new book, guys, The Roots of Obama's Rage. It's $10, and I'll be doing a book signing, which, by the way, I'll be doing at 12 noon. And if you want a book, it'll cost you $10. And so let's say a third of you or half of you say, yeah, you know what, I think I'd like to get Dinesh's book. I got $100, I'm happy to buy one for 10. And so let's say 500 people buy my book, and suddenly we now have inequality. Why? Because I have 500 people putting up $10, so I have $5,000 plus my original 100. I have $5,100, putting me in the top 1%, right? And then you are divided into two groups, the people who have 100 and the people who spend 10, so they only have 90 left. So we now have three classes. You may say the lower group with 90, the middle group with 100, and then one guy, Dinesh, with all this dough, the 1%. Now here's the question to ask. Where's the social injustice in any of this? Sure, we have inequality, but the inequality is produced voluntarily. The people who put up the $10 wanted the book. To them, the book was worth at least $10. Otherwise, they wouldn't have done it. So even though there's inequality, there's no social injustice. And in fact, I would go further and say any effort to interfere with the result of this transaction, to, let's say, rearrange it, to grab, let's say, my earnings and then distribute it in some way, would create far more injustice than exists in the current distribution. Let me close by saying that socialism was a big, grand idea. Half the world lived under it. And if you go back to the 1850s or the 1890s, it's sort of understandable how idealistic people thought this might be the way to organize the world. But I think for intelligent people to advocate it now, in the wake of the huge debris of human bodies, the millions of people killed under socialist regimes, look at where socialism is being tried now. North Korea, Zimbabwe, Cuba, Venezuela. Look at the way it has crushed those people's dreams. Socialism is a nightmare. It's ruined much of the world. It's not going to ruin us because we're not going to let it. Thank you very much.
Well, I've argued that a liberal or libertarian ideal of liberty, embedded in the form of capitalism most capitalists defend, can be seen to support a right to welfare by applying the odd implies can principle to conflicts between the rich and the poor. When applied, the principle supports such rights by favoring the liberty of the poor over the liberty of the rich, which leads to a form of socialism as Dinesh and I understand it. Now, it turns out we may be in agreement on this. This kind of socialism for the poor is agreeable. This is the safety net socialism. So in order to see whether we could agree more, let me talk a little bit more about socialism. So most societies that have called themselves socialist in the 20th and 21st century have not embodied, or have not simply embodied, the socialism I defend. Clearly, most of these societies did not limit themselves to socialism for the poor that I defend, and now maybe Dinesh defends. Sadly, they also introduced what I would call socialism for the rich, or crony socialism, and that is morally objectionable. Unfortunately, many capitalist societies have also not limited themselves to socialism for the poor that I defend. Sadly, they also have introduced what I would call socialism for the rich, or crony capitalism, and that too is morally objectionable. So whether societies call themselves socialist or capitalist, in my view, they should limit themselves to socialism for the poor and reject socialism for the rich, or more generally, crony capitalism or crony socialism. So we may turn out to agree on that too. Now, let me just take the example that Dinesh gave near the end there about publishing books. I would think maybe I was publishing the book, but that's okay. But you have to have the situation defined a little bit more precisely. Imagine you all have a decent minimum. You're all at least there, no problem there, and you have some money above the minimum, or just a little bit more maybe, and that's where the equality is. And then I publish this book. You all give me $10, and I've got a lot more money than anybody's got. Now, suppose something else happens, that one of you, through no fault of your own, no longer you lose your money, you no longer can meet your basic needs. Now I see a problem. I think that some of my surplus can be attached to bring you up, because it's no fault of your own, out of your lack of not being able to make your basic needs. So that's the socialism for the poor that I defend. I think that's defendable, even if you start off with this, we're all equal, and then some, for no fault of their own, fall below, some with voluntary agreement get above, then we still have redistribution as a moral requirement, because the liberty of the poor here is more important than the people who have now become the rich. Thank you.
I think that we reached the point in the debate where there's a little bit of confusion about what we mean by the topic we're debating. In Professor Sturber's example, you have a group of prosperous guys, and you have one guy who has fallen on hard times, as he puts it, and is, let's just say, desperately needy. And the socialism he's defending, I would argue a very moderate form of socialism, is society and the rich, which is to say all of us, have an obligation, and an obligation, if necessary, through the state to help that guy. Now, I would say that this idea can be defended under a very modest type of social insurance that basically says, we call it the safety net. This has been in place in America since the 1930s. It's basically a way of saying any of us could fall through the cracks in which we are desperately in need of food or medical attention. And in a decent society that has the means, we have to make allowance for that guy. I want to submit in America that even when we think about the poor, take the homeless. And I was just in LA, as I mentioned, rows and rows of shacks, homeless guys living in there, and they do some of what Professor Sturber is saying. They'll walk up to a restaurant where some guy's eating a piece of chicken, they'll pick up a chicken leg and bite into it. And there's not a whole lot you can do, kind of for the reason Professor Sturber goes, it's the way San Francisco views it, the moral claim of the guy to eat takes precedence over the rich guy's claim not to be disturbed during his dinner. He can surely afford to part with that chicken leg. But the real problem, of course, is that many of these homeless guys are addicts, or they're alcoholics, or they're drug addicts. And our society has places and homes and medical treatment for them, but driven by the left, the socialist camp, the left went to the courts and said that if you make these guys get medical care, if you keep them in facilities, if you give them treatment and food and showers, you are violating their civil rights. They have the right to walk out of here and live on the street. So ultimately, the socialism the Democrats are recommending is based on a problem that they created. Now, I want to answer an argument that Professor Sturber didn't fully make, but I think is implicit in what he said. And that is the argument that we hear on the left a lot about why forcible confiscation of stuff is allowed, because modern socialism, American socialism, is democratic socialism. It's not some dictator who grabs your stuff by force with a secret police. It's that the people vote through a majority to establish these programs and these forms of confiscation. I want to actually show why the morality of democratic socialism is no better than the morality of authoritarian socialism. So once again, we do it by, in a philosophical sense, taking a kind of classic example. This room, all of us right here. And let's say we're 500 of us or 800 of us, and let's say that a majority, or even 99%, vote to pick one guy, let's say Charlie Kirk, and take all his stuff. Right? Now we voted, it's democratic, we've decided by a clear majority, in fact a decisive majority, but would any serious person argue that it is right that we do this? Just because we have the power to do it, because we outnumber Charlie Kirk. Charlie Kirk is kind of this thin, gangly guy. It's really easy for us to pin him down, pull his pants off, take his food, take his computer. No, to me, democratic socialism differs from socialism kind of in the way that gang rape differs from individual rape. But in both cases, it's forcible confiscation. There's no real difference. Look, there is a broad decency in America that has always supported programs for the needy and the poor. When Tocqueville wrote in the early part of the 19th century, he was really amazed by the fact that there was a profusion of civic associations, in a sense the early version of the Salvation Army, the Red Cross and so on, the churches which undertook this function of expressing American compassion and sharing the surplus of the successful with the not so successful. Here's the point I want to leave you with. Isn't this a task better left to the people who have the means? Now, Professor Sturber would say no, because ultimately, A, they may not want to give, and B, they may not give in the right way. So take Bill Gates. Bill Gates is buying millions of mosquito nets for people all over the world to save them from malaria. It may be a good idea, it may be a bad idea. 100 years ago, Andrew Carnegie built 2,500 public libraries in the United States. It may be a good idea, it may be a bad idea, but here's my question. Number one, do you honestly think that if you take Carnegie's money or Bill Gates's money and give it to 450 goons in Washington, D.C., that they would spend that money better? No. And why? Because it's not their money. So they will abuse it. And they have been abusing it. And they've been abusing us. And so I say, let Bill Gates buy the mosquito nets. Let Andrew Carnegie build his libraries. It's their money, and ultimately I trust them to do more good with it than all these vote-buying scoundrels in Washington who ultimately are looking to themselves, not the poor. Thank you very much.